What if the first people to take a reed and press symbols into wet clay were not trying to record what had already happened, but were desperately attempting to stop something from happening again? What if the night sky, which we now admire as a peaceful dome of stars, was once regarded as a looming threat, a place where destruction dwelled, a place whose movements had once determined whether entire civilizations lived or died? In the vast, sun-scorched lands of southern Mesopotamia, where heat bends light into shimmering rivers and the landscape carries memories older than spoken language, remnants of this forgotten terror still linger. Beneath dunes that shift like restless spirits lie clay tablets that were shaped by hands millennia ago, each mark pressed with purpose, each line carrying a warning meant for those who would come after. Today, these tablets sit in quiet rooms and museum drawers, their voices muted, waiting for someone who remembers how to listen. Our journey begins not with a groundbreaking discovery, but with bewilderment. When European archaeologists began exploring the ancient mounds near Uruk, Lagash, and Sippar in the late 19th century, they expected the usual remnants of early civilization: broken pottery, primitive tools, and maybe a few decorative items or religious symbols. Instead, they uncovered thousands of clay tablets, neatly stacked, preserved beyond reason, as though a catastrophe had sealed them away intentionally. These tablets predated Greece, Rome, and nearly all of the cultures that would later dominate world history. Yet they were not the clumsy scribblings of a culture just learning how to write. They contained mathematics, architecture, trade documentation, and, most unsettling of all, astronomical observations of incredible precision. The Sumerians, whose civilization emerged seemingly out of nowhere around 3500 BCE, had not only mapped the night sky, they had done it with a sophistication that should have required thousands of years of study. Their star catalogues listed constellations exactly as they appeared in their era. Their calculations of Venus's cycle were accurate down to the day. They charted lunar phases and eclipse predictions with a mathematical certainty that modern software can verify. There was no learning curve, no primitive phase where they stumbled through trial and error. Their knowledge appeared complete from the very start, as though they inherited it fully formed. This raises a question historians have been unable to dismiss. Where did this knowledge come from? Civilizations develop slowly, people refine ideas over generations. But the Sumerians defied this pattern. They arrived already counting in base 60, already measuring time, already observing the heavens like seasoned astronomers whose lives depended on the outcome. And perhaps that is the key. For them, the sky was not a place of wonder, it was a place of danger. Archaeologists expected administrative texts, grain inventories, tax lists, temple offerings. They found those, of course, but mixed among them were tablets describing stars that crossed forbidden paths, stones of fire falling from heaven, winds that scorched the land without rain, and gods who hurled destruction from above. These were not legends embroidered with poetic detail. They were written in the same terse, technical language as trade accounts and legal codes. This was not mythology. This was documentation. One tablet described a burning wind that moved across the land, leaving no smoke yet turning the horizon into flames. Another recorded a star whose arrival in the east brought famine. A third spoke of a celestial object with a tail that stretched across the night like a wound. These stories were filed alongside real numbers, dates, and observations, not treated as metaphors but as natural phenomena. No priest chanting prophecy, no storyteller embellishing a tale, only a sober record of something the writers believed future generations must never ignore. To hold one of these tablets is to feel time pressing against your fingers. Imagine the clay beneath your touch, still bearing the faint ridges of a scribe's fingerprints, someone who lived 5,000 years ago, someone whose heart may have raced as he carved warnings into mud before the sun baked them into permanence. Their writing system was not an alphabet in the modern sense. Each symbol carried layers of meaning, sound, concept, and association. What looks to us like an indecipherable sequence of wedges was, to them, a compressed message loaded with significance. These messages were not limited to texts. The cities themselves were instruments. When excavators uncovered the massive step temples known as ziggurats, they initially believed them to be purely religious structures. But measurements revealed something astonishing. Their corners aligned not only with the cardinal directions, but also with specific points on the horizon where constellations would rise at key times of the year. Taurus, the Pleiades, Orion's belt. These structures were not the product of random architectural choices. They were observatories designed to track celestial events. Even their myths carry the fingerprints of trauma. The Sumerians spoke of a time before cities existed, a time when knowledge did not evolve naturally, but was given to them by beings who rose from the waters after a great flood. Most scholars dismiss this as symbolic language, yet the consistency of these stories across different cultures is unsettling. Civilizations separated by oceans and thousands of years, from ancient Mesopotamia to the early Hebrews, Hindus and Mesoamerican peoples, all tell eerily similar tales. A world-ending catastrophe, fire from the heavens, darkness that lingered, waters that consumed entire landscapes, and survivors who emerged determined to preserve what they knew. These narratives do not read like inventions, they read like memories. The idea that these ancient cultures simply borrowed stories from each other collapses under scrutiny. How could civilizations that never interacted describe the same sequence of destruction? Why did so many of them insist that the sky had once turned deadly, that stars had betrayed them, that the world had nearly ended before humanity was ready to record its own existence? Perhaps these were not myths. Perhaps they were warnings. And if they were warnings, then the tablets are less historical records and more time capsules, messages encoded for future generations that would one day regain the ability to understand the sky. This would explain why the earliest Sumerian writing is not agricultural, not political, but astronomical. It would explain why they built vast platforms to watch the heavens. It would explain why their scribes were not simply priests, but scientists in ceremonial robes. One of the most chilling implications is the recurring assumption in their texts that the audience already knows what makes the sky dangerous. They do not explain why a certain star's appearance is catastrophic. They do not justify their obsession with tracking celestial cycles across centuries. They assume the reader is aware that death has already fallen from above. They assume the reader understands that certain objects in the night sky return. Time and again, the tablets are not trying to convince. They are trying to remind. The silence surrounding these records is what makes them so unsettling. At night, when museum lights fade, one can almost imagine those tablets exhaling, releasing memories from a world that no longer exists. We regard the Sumerians as the beginning of civilization, but perhaps they were what remained after something older was destroyed. Perhaps they weren't inventing culture. Perhaps they were rebuilding it. Their obsession with the heavens was not philosophical curiosity. It was survival. They knew that something catastrophic had happened before the birth of their world. Something had struck the earth, not metaphorically but physically, with such force that everything humanity had known up to that point was erased. Only fragments remained. Fragments of knowledge, fragments of memory, fragments pressed into clay with trembling hands that could still feel the heat of a sky that once burned. And so the inevitable question arises: what were they searching for in the night? What did they track so desperately that they built their temples as instruments? What pattern did they believe would return? What convinced them that history was a cycle of destruction waiting for the next strike? The answer, according to their tablets, begins not with some philosophical revelation but with dust. Dust found inside the ruins of ancient cities. Dust preserved in layers of soil that should not exist if the earth had never been touched by fire from the sky. When archaeologists reached the deepest layers of these ancient settlements, they began to uncover evidence that forced them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about early civilization. In 1922, during a major excavation, workers clearing away centuries of compacted sediment revealed the foundation of a ziggurat whose alignment was unmistakably deliberate. Its base was oriented toward the rising point of Sirius during a specific epoch, and its auxiliary structures aligned with the Pleiades at their highest position in the night sky. What had been assumed to be shrines was something more calculated. Architectural mechanisms meant to track celestial bodies with extreme accuracy. Even more perplexing were symbols carved into the threshold stones of these structures. They were not prayers, dedications, or hymnal invocations. They were numbers, angular measurements written in a base 60 system, the very same mathematical structure humanity still uses today to divide circles into degrees and hours into minutes and seconds. These markings made it clear that the building was, in its essence, an observation platform masquerading as a temple. The discovery unsettled the lead excavator, who confessed in his journal that he felt he had not uncovered a place of worship, but a scientific instrument disguised in the trappings of religion. As excavations expanded, this pattern repeated itself. City after city revealed structures engineered not for mythic symbolism, but for observational purpose. At Eridu, the oldest known Sumerian city, 7 temples had been built one atop another over centuries. Each successive reconstruction subtly shifted its alignment, compensating for the gradual celestial drift caused by the Earth's axial wobble. These weren't haphazard rebuilding efforts. They were calibrations carried out across generations, ensuring the temple continued pointing toward a specific region of the sky. At Nippur, another sacred site, the courtyard wasn't oriented toward impressive vistas or processional routes. It was arranged to frame a narrow slice of horizon, where Venus rose during one of its most significant orbital cycles. These cities were not organized around rivers, trade routes, or military defensibility, as one might expect from early urban centers. They were placed according to celestial geometry. Their architects positioned entire populations as if the cities were sensors in a grand observational grid. The Sumerians were not merely watching the sky, they were triangulating something. Beneath the administrative tablets that tracked barley harvests and labor contracts, scholars found a series of documents known today as omen texts, records that linked movements in the heavens to events on Earth. These were not stories, they were conditionals. If one celestial body crossed another's path at a certain time, a specific outcome was expected: drought, invasion, famine, or fire. For decades, scholars dismissed these tablets as superstition, primitive attempts to draw connections where none existed, but hidden. Among them were 3 unusual fragments that refused to conform to such interpretations. The first described a stone from the sky that fell during the reign of a forgotten king, striking the fields and transforming sand into glass. The second recounted a wind with no rain that scorched the land and caused the very air to shimmer as if set aflame. The third warned of a star with a tail so bright it looked like a wound in the sky, ushering in a season of dust. At first, archaeologists catalogued these as mythic exaggerations. Later, when scientists compared these texts with physical evidence, melted soil, layers of microscopic spherical debris, anomalous concentrations of metallic elements, they realized these were literal descriptions of cataclysmic events. As scholars continued to dig through the chronological layers of Sumerian settlements, something unprecedented emerged. The earliest cities did not show a gradual progression toward complexity. They did not transition from huts to houses to monumental structures in the expected developmental curve. They appeared fully formed, complete with writing systems, mathematics, astronomical knowledge, and sophisticated irrigation techniques. The question was no longer how they developed civilization, it was how they restored it. In some layers, beneath the stone foundations, archaeologists encountered remnants of settlements that had existed before the Sumerians, villages that showed signs of sudden abandonment, scorch marks, vitrified materials, and ash deposits that seemed unrelated to natural fire. Something had happened, leaving a quiet gap in the region's history before the Sumerian cities appeared. It was as though the world had ended, and someone had returned with the memory of how to begin again. An even more remarkable artifact appeared during excavations in the early 20th century, a star catalogue composed of a series of tablets that scholars would later name Mulapan. These tablets listed constellations, their rising and setting times, and the motions of visible planets. Modern astronomers tested these records against simulations of the ancient night sky, and discovered something extraordinary. The data was correct. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, correct. But buried within this technical brilliance were anomalies. Certain stars bore markings that did not refer to agricultural or seasonal cycles, but indicated danger. Specific dates were noted not for planting or rituals, but for vigilance. One section of the catalogue described what the scribes called the path of the destroyer, a trajectory across the heavens that returned after a vast interval. The text specified that this cycle was measured not in years, but in units that multiplied into periods long enough to exceed human memory, cycles of 3,600 years. For centuries, scholars had no idea what this could mean. The number did not match the orbital period of any known planet. It did not correspond to the revolution of any celestial body catalogued by ancient or modern science. Only in recent decades have astronomers begun mapping long-period cometary debris fields and identified patterns that echo this timescale. The Sumerians had tracked something that did not belong to the ordinary clockwork of the heavens, something that returned infrequently but catastrophically. One tablet discovered in the early 20th century shocked even the most skeptical researchers. Unlike the majority of omen texts, which describe past occurrences, this one was written entirely in the future tense. It began with a conditional. When a specific star returns to a particular position in the constellation associated with the bull, destruction follows. It continued by providing a calculation. The calculation projected not years or seasons, but centuries. The Sumerians had not only recorded what had happened, they attempted to predict what would happen again. By the early 20th century, scholars were beginning to understand that this was a civilization gripped by the need to remember. They had seen something so devastating that they could not bear the thought of future generations forgetting it. They entrusted their warnings not to storytellers who would embellish, nor to priests who might reinterpret, but to astronomers and scribes who measured patterns and inscribed what they observed into clay. The more scholars studied the tablets, the more they realized that Sumerian observations were not random. Their priests did not merely gaze at the stars to divine fortune. They were monitoring a threat. They tracked planets, comets, meteors, and celestial alignments with a precision unmatched until the invention of telescopes. The Sumerians had built systematic mechanisms for early detection, temples that doubled as observatories, priesthoods trained in mathematical calculation, rituals that marked periods of heightened risk. It became increasingly clear that their mythology was a survival manual encoded in allegory. The gods they worshipped were not abstractions but personifications of forces that could destroy them. Their calendar was not a cycle of celebrations but a countdown to danger. Their architecture was not symbolic but functional. Their stories were not fantasies but memories. And if these people lived with such vigilance, what did they expect to return? To answer that question, scholars were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Sumerians regarded the sky not as a realm of inspiration but as a battlefield. They believed that certain celestial bodies were not fixed but wandering invaders. They believed that fire could fall without warning. They believed that cycles of destruction were woven into the fabric of time, and that survival depended on recognizing the signs before the heavens opened again. When modern researchers began comparing impact events across human history, a shocking realization emerged. The Earth has not been struck randomly throughout time. Catastrophic impacts cluster. They come in waves, they align with cycles, and the Sumerians appeared to have known this. Their priests maintained calculations that stretched across centuries, far beyond any individual's lifespan. They trained their successors to update these counts faithfully, never allowing the knowledge to be forgotten. One of their tablets states plainly that those who read the signs must be prepared, because what has happened once will inevitably happen again. This realization gives new meaning to the ruins scattered across the Mesopotamian plain. They are not merely relics of a vanished people. They are monuments erected by survivors who believed that the only thing more dangerous than cosmic fire was forgetting it. The dust preserved in their cities is not merely soil. It is the residue of something that once came from the sky, something they witnessed, something they feared, something they expected to return. The deeper scholars pushed into the origins of human civilization, the more a startling pattern emerged. The world had not begun with a slow accumulation of knowledge, but with a reboot forced upon those who survived some unfathomable devastation. If the Sumerians truly inherited a memory rather than created a new world from scratch, then the smoking gun had to be somewhere, not in their myths, not in their temples, but in the ground itself. And as it turned out, the Earth had been keeping its own ledger. In the early years of the 21st century, geological research uncovered something previously overlooked: a blackened layer of sediment stretching across continents, a thin, dark boundary separating two epochs of Earth's climate. This layer appeared simultaneously in North America, Europe, and the Near East. It was filled with microscopic diamonds formed under intense pressure, metallic spherules created at temperatures far exceeding anything ancient humans could produce, and dust infused with elements not native to Earth's crust. These are not the byproducts of volcanoes, floods, or fires. They are signatures of something far more violent, of objects exploding with unimaginable force as they tore through the atmosphere. Embedded within this layer were the ashes of forests that once stood tall, their trunks flash-burned into charcoal in seconds. Heat had fused sand into glass and baked soil into a molten crust. For centuries, scholars had dismissed the Great Destruction myths as exaggerations of local floods or political upheavals. But the Earth's surface told another story. These were not metaphors. They were scars. Archaeologists soon found themselves forced into uncomfortable agreement with the Sumerian worldview. The world had ended before, and not metaphorically, the world had literally burned. A comet or fragments of a celestial body had collided with Earth, not as a single catastrophic impact, but as a swarm of fiery missiles raining down upon multiple regions. This event triggered fires so large that the smoke dimmed the sun for years, plunging temperatures and sending ecosystems into chaos. It was not merely destruction, it was a reset. Civilizations that had begun to form before this cataclysm vanished almost without a trace. The fragile web of early agriculture and settlement collapsed. Humanity, reduced again to survival mode, took millennia to rise. But something else emerged from the ashes, an insistence upon remembering. Those who survived did not rebuild blindly. They carried fragments of knowledge: how to watch the sky, how to count patterns in the heavens, how to track objects whose trajectories might spell doom. They passed these fragments to their children not as legends, but as instructions. Eventually, in the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, the fragments coalesced into a civilization that behaved as though it were haunted. Sumer did not treat the stars with reverence. It treated them like predators. Track the heavens the way a hunted animal studies the forest, watching for a familiar silhouette, knowing it will return eventually. The question shifted from whether the Sumerians believed in celestial threats to how they knew them so intimately. The answer lay in what modern astronomers discovered about Earth's orbit. Our planet does not drift aimlessly through an empty void. Twice every year it passes through a dense debris stream, the remnant trail of a colossal comet that broke apart tens of thousands of years ago. The Earth travels through this river of cosmic rubble, like a ship passing through a field of mines. Most years only dust and tiny fragments strike the atmosphere, burning harmlessly as meteors. But within this debris are larger bodies, boulders, ice masses, and metallic fragments, big enough to survive entry and explode with the force of nuclear weapons. This debris field has a name now, though its modern designation is far less ominous than what the Sumerians called it. Astronomers identify it as a meteor complex, one with periodic intensifications. Its fragments periodically cluster more densely, forming invisible pockets of danger that Earth inevitably encounters. Every few thousand years, the planet passes through such a dense region, dramatically increasing the odds of impacts. Suddenly, the Sumerian obsession with cycles, numbers, and celestial alignments no longer seemed irrational. Their warnings were not superstition. They were data. The most disquieting feature of their records was how clearly they distinguished between ordinary astronomical events and moments when danger peaked. Their tablets marked certain periods of the year as hazardous. Their temples pointed toward constellations associated not with gods of blessing, but with omens of catastrophe. Their rituals did not celebrate bounty, they prepared for fire. It became evident that the Sumerians believed celestial danger was not a random possibility, but a predictable inevitability. They developed mathematical systems capable of tracking these cycles. They created institutions dedicated to observing the heavens. They encoded this information into myths not out of ignorance, but because myth could survive translation across tongues, collapse of cities, and burning of libraries. A calculation might be lost, a temple might fall. But a story about an angry god hurling fire from the sky would endure. The more researchers examined these myths, the more their tone changed. Deities long thought to embody natural forces suddenly revealed themselves as analogues for astronomical events. A god who tore mountains apart with wind was not the wind itself, but the shock wave created when a celestial object exploded in the atmosphere. A deity who scorched the earth did not represent sunlight, but the thermal pulse of a fireball descending from space. The flood myths were not metaphors for seasonal rivers. They were recollections of oceans boiling, rivers evaporating, and rain falling black with ash. Whole cultures had been speaking in code, and the Sumerians were the keepers of that code. Once this interpretation took root, everything changed. The meticulous alignments of ancient structures, long thought to be religious expressions, were revealed as tracking devices. Their priests were astronomers in ceremonial garb. Their festivals mapped to celestial events whose importance had been forgotten. Their calendar functioned not as a framework for agricultural cycles, but as a countdown. The further scholars looked, the clearer this became. Ancient texts described celestial objects not as distant, lifeless stones, but as agents of destruction, moving entities whose returns mark the beginning of epochs of suffering. They spoke of cycles measured not by human lifetimes, but by cosmic schedules. To the Sumerians, history was not a line, it was a circle, and circles inevitably close. Some tablets explicitly stated that certain celestial cycles had not reached their conclusion at the time of writing. They suggested that future generations would witness the return of something that had already once destroyed the world. They even recorded instructions for recognizing the signs: a star with a tail, a sudden increase in light streaking across the night sky, strange winds, dimming sunlight, and seasons that did not follow their proper order. These omens were not to be feared superstitiously. They were checkpoints in a vast cosmic clock. What terrified modern scholars was not the existence of these cycles, but their timing. When researchers reconstructed Sumerian calculations and projected them forward, the dates they identified did not point to millennia in the distant future. They pointed nearer, much nearer. The implications were staggering. A culture thousands of years old had tracked something that modern science only recently rediscovered. They had built an edifice of architecture, mathematics, language, and ritual around a threat so overwhelming that the mere act of forgetting it would doom their descendants. Humanity had not ascended from ignorance into wisdom. It had survived disaster, inherited instructions, and then forgotten why those instructions existed. This realization reframed the Sumerian civilization completely. They were not pioneering human progress. They were custodians of memory. Their ziggurats were not monuments to gods. They were warning devices. Their star catalogues were not philosophical musings. They were targeting coordinates, and the object they feared was not gone. It was late, but it was coming. The idea that ancient tablets might contain predictive astronomy, actual projections of future cosmic events, seemed impossible. Yet every time researchers cross-referenced Sumerian records with modern orbital calculations, the correlations intensified. Their long cycles corresponded to periods when Earth passed through denser pockets of the cosmic debris field. Their omens aligned with epochs marked by global cooling or widespread collapse. Their mythology mapped directly onto geological layers of ash and melted Earth. The Sumerians were not wrong. Modern researchers now face a chilling possibility. The reason early civilizations seemed to emerge suddenly, fully formed, was not cultural brilliance. It was necessity. The survivors of a world-ending event had no interest in experimenting with counting systems, religion, or astronomy. They resurrected what had saved them. They built on foundations older than their cities. They carried knowledge they had not discovered, but preserved. The next step is unavoidable. If the past holds records of destruction, and those records contain patterns, then the real question is not whether ancient civilizations witnessed cosmic impacts. The real question is when the next one is due. If the ancient Sumerians truly believed that the heavens followed cycles of destruction, then their world was not defined by myth, but by vigilance. They did not look up at the night sky for comfort or inspiration. They looked because they remembered. Their duty was not spiritual adoration, it was survival, and survival demanded watching. To understand the magnitude of their obsession, one must examine the heart of their civilization, the ziggurat. These towering structures dominated Sumerian cities, rising above the plains like stairways to the cosmos. At first glance, they appear purely religious, monuments dedicated to gods and festivals. But the deeper scholars studied them, the more inconsistencies appeared. Why did so many of these edifices align not with local geography, but with celestial markers? Why did they prioritize visibility of specific points on the horizon rather than ease of access or defense? Why did their staircases, windows, and courtyards all seem to direct attention toward the sky? The answer slowly emerged. These were not temples at all. They were observatories, purpose-built instruments of astronomical surveillance disguised as holy places so that no ruler, war, or cultural shift would dare to abandon them. What looked like rituals were protocols. What sounded like hymns were mnemonic codes. What seemed like devotion was data collection. Every major Sumerian city maintained priests whose duties went far beyond religious rites. They recorded planetary positions with meticulous detail. They calculated lunar phases, planetary conjunctions, and seasonal variations. They monitored the behavior of comets, tracked meteor showers, and watched for anomalies in the night sky. Their role was scientific, mathematical, and unapologetically pragmatic. Yet their society cloaked this profession in sacred language so that the importance of their work could be preserved through cultural collapse. These priests did not choose their successors. Their successors were chosen for them, selected from childhood, tested for memory, aptitude, and mathematical skill. They trained for decades before they were permitted to inscribe a single mark into clay. Their minds were repositories of knowledge, their bodies instruments of continuity. Their failure was not religious sin, it was treason against civilization. Evidence of this system appears in the oldest instructional tablets, which describe an educational structure unlike any other in antiquity. They did not teach writing as a skill. They taught it as a responsibility. Each apprentice learned not only how to read symbols, but how to understand cycles, cycles of stars, cycles of seasons, cycles of catastrophe. Some tablets even outline the punishment for neglecting celestial duties: confiscation, exile, sometimes death. The sky, after all, was not a matter of curiosity. It was a predator waiting to pounce. The temples themselves were updated over centuries, not for aesthetic reasons, but to adjust their alignments as Earth's axis shifted. This constant recalibration is the clearest proof that the Sumerians understood a principle modern astronomy did not rediscover until millennia later: precession, the slow wobble of Earth's rotation causing stars to drift across the horizon over generations. That the Sumerians measured and compensated for this drift implies observational data spanning hundreds, if not thousands, of years. No single civilization could have discovered precession without inheriting a legacy of stargazing older than itself. Their rituals reveal the same logic. The Sumerian New Year festival, for example, lasted a precise number of days and required priests to watch specific constellations at exact times. To later cultures, these rites looked like symbolic reenactments of cosmic battles, but the tablets describing them show something different. They were systematic observations conducted at critical seasonal junctures when the Earth moved closer to regions of heightened celestial risk. This reinterpretation dismantles the assumption that ancient people invented elaborate mythologies to explain natural wonders they didn't understand. Instead, It appears they used myth as a shield to protect a deeper truth, a truth too dangerous to be forgotten, yet too complex to survive unless embedded into culture. A number can be erased. A god cannot. It was not only temples and rituals that encoded warnings. The gods themselves were cosmological entities thinly veiled beneath personification. The Sumerian storm god was not merely the bringer of wind. He was the embodiment of atmospheric shock, the thunderous blast wave that accompanies a celestial object detonation. His myths speak of a wind without clouds that crushes cities and strips flesh from bones. Today, scientists call this a high-energy airburst. Another deity governs fire from heaven, fire that arrives without smoke, capable of melting stone and turning rivers to steam. These descriptions align perfectly with the thermal pulse of a large meteor fragment exploding in the sky, releasing more energy than a modern nuclear detonation. Even the Sumerian goddess connected with love and war derived her identity not from emotion, but from astronomy. She was associated with Venus, not the planet as a romantic symbol, but Venus in moments when its path intersected the region of the sky that portended cosmic danger. When Venus appeared in particular alignments, the Sumerians believed destruction followed. This was not superstition. It was historical observation memorialized as divine behavior. Once scholars made these connections, they found themselves facing a tantalizing hypothesis. The Sumerians had turned astronomy into theology to ensure its survival. They understood that empires fall, languages die, and libraries burn. But people remember stories about gods. If the Sumerians were encoding warnings within myth, then the myths of later civilizations, Babylonian, Akkadian, Hebrew, Greek, were not independent inventions. They were translations, reinterpretations, and distortions of a message that began long before writing existed. Each culture layered its own beliefs atop the original instructions, obscuring their meaning while preserving their structure. This explains why so many ancient cosmologies describe battles in the heavens, divine weapons that streak across the sky, and floods that reset the world. These stories are not random, they are convergent. And convergence is the fingerprint of truth. The archaeological record mirrors the mythological one. Time and again, human civilizations collapsed not due to gradual decline but sudden disaster. Cities burned without evidence of warfare. Entire populations disappeared. Agricultural systems failed for reasons no drought could explain. Geological layers corresponding to these collapses contained signatures of intense atmospheric disturbance. Particles forged by high-temperature events and darkened skies that blocked sunlight for years. The first known collapse coincides with the end of the last ice age, when countless species vanished in a geological instant. The second aligns with the fall of early Mesopotamian settlements. The third corresponds to the sudden destruction of the Akkadian Empire, when texts speak of a wind so fierce that no crops grew and the sky darkened for generations. The fourth marks the end of Bronze Age civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean. Each of these events appears to echo the same pattern: fire, darkness, famine, migration, and silence. If civilization has been destroyed repeatedly, then the Sumerians were not the first to watch the heavens, they were merely the first whose warning survived. The implications deepen when one considers how Sumerian astronomical texts treat time. They do not describe years as discrete units. They treat them as intervals within cycles, cycles that extend backward into prehistory and forward into epochs we have not yet reached. Their mathematics imply that cosmic danger is not a matter of chance but of schedule. Their calculations suggest a return, not a possibility. The more scholars deciphered these cycles, the more they realized that the Sumerians did not see history as linear. They believed time was a wheel, and at certain points along its circumference destruction waited. They charted those points not in stories, but in numbers. Numbers that modern astronomy has independently confirmed. This leads to the most sobering realization: the cycle they tracked has not yet finished. If the Sumerians were correct, and evidence increasingly supports the notion, then humanity is not living in peace. We are living in the quiet between storms. Our era is not the culmination of civilization. It is an intermission. As researchers project ancient cycles forward, grim possibilities emerge. We may be approaching the very moment the Sumerians feared. Their descendants forgot the code. Their myths became fantasy. Their cycles turned into curiosities. Their temples were buried. Their language was lost. But their message endures, not in words, but in warnings we are only now able to read again. The Sumerians did not ask whether the sky would betray humanity. They asked when. And they believed the answer was not millennia beyond human reach. It was within the future of their own descendants who would rebuild the world, achieve wonders, and eventually develop the tools required to understand what had been written long before. We are those descendants. What remains is the most unsettling question of all. If the Sumerians preserved calculations pointing toward a future epoch of cosmic danger, if their tablets tracked cycles of destruction with uncanny accuracy, then what happens when the cycle reaches completion? If this is not myth, but mathematics, then the countdown has already begun. If the ancients truly believed that cosmic destruction was cyclical, the natural next step was not merely to remember the past, but to calculate the future. This realization transforms the Sumerian tablets from historical curiosities into something far more unsettling: predictive instruments. They were not just archives of what had happened. They were attempts to forecast what would come next. Clues to this purpose lie in the structure of their counting systems. The Sumerians did not measure time the way later civilizations did. They did not rely solely on lunar years, solar cycles, or reigns of kings. Their numbers stretched across spans so vast no single human could hope to comprehend them without written guidance. They tracked intervals, overlaying cycles upon cycles like gears in an invisible cosmic mechanism. Each cycle triggered another, and when certain alignments overlapped, danger peaked. To maintain this knowledge across generations, they encoded celestial cycles into rituals and narratives. Their myths speak of ages separated by floods, fires, and long nights in which sunlight was stolen from the world. Their gods battled not for territory or pride, but for dominance over time itself. Hidden beneath these tales were instructions. Watch the sky when particular planets converge, guard the horizon when a certain star rises with the dawn, prepare for famine when fire falls from the heavens. Their world was not governed by divine whim, it was governed by celestial mechanics, and they behaved accordingly. It is easy to imagine the Sumerians living in superstition, but nothing could be further from the truth. Their society was structured around observation. They refined mathematics not to entertain themselves, but because survival depended on calculation. Their calendars were not tools of agriculture alone, they were countdown devices. One tablet, heavily worn and fractured, describes a moment when the count is complete. Another claims that the watchers must stand ready when the wandering star crosses the path of the bull. These phrases meant nothing to scholars who believed the stars were symbols rather than coordinates. But when astronomers reconstructed the ancient night sky and mapped the Sumerian references to constellations, many of these warnings aligned with celestial regions associated with meteor streams. It became clear that the Sumerians did not fear the heavens in general. They feared something specific, something that moved along a recurring path, something they had seen before. Their word for this object varied across eras and dialects, but the meaning remained consistent. It was not a planet, nor a deity, nor a metaphor. It was a celestial intruder, a wanderer, a bringer of fire. The Sumerians tracked it with such precision that they recorded not only its appearances, but its intervals of return. This explains why their astronomical texts emphasize periodicity. To them, danger was not random, it was rhythmic. Once scholars accepted this premise, everything that once seemed strange now made sense. The grand temples were not shrines, they were vantage points. The priests were not mystics, they were observers. The festivals were not holidays, they were checkpoints. The Sumerians had built an entire civilization around a single idea. Disaster is not a question of if, but when. Their world was ordered toward one purpose, survival through memory. And yet, for all their vigilance, the tablets also carry a quiet resignation. Some inscriptions suggest that their ancestors had once ignored the warnings. They describe a time when the sky gave signs that went unheeded, and the cost was annihilation. The survivors, those who became the Sumerians, emerged into a quieter world, but they carried trauma like a seed. They built cities, not because they sought glory, but because a stable society was necessary to maintain their watch. From this perspective, humanity's first civilization was not the beginning of culture. It was a guard tower. If this interpretation holds true, the implications are disturbing. It means that civilization itself, writing, math, cities, architecture, may not have been born from invention, but from fear. Humanity did not rise because it wished to improve its condition. It rose because it refused to die again. The Sumerians were not innovators. They were custodians of a warning. For thousands of years, their system worked. Priests calculated, cities watched, myths preserved. But as time passed, empires rose and fell. Each successor inherited fragments of the code, distorted it, reframed it, and in doing so, diluted its meaning. The Babylonians inherited the stars but forgot the danger. The Akkadians preserved the mathematics but lost the context. The Greeks retained the constellations but discarded the warnings. By the time astronomy became a scientific discipline in the modern era, the myth had been separated from its purpose. Humanity remembered how to count the stars but forgot why the stars had been counted. We became complacent. We lost the ability to interpret the sky as the Sumerians once did. We looked for beauty, not threat. We categorized comets and meteors as spectacles, not heralds. We turned ancient warnings into bedtime stories and congratulated ourselves for being rational. But the universe does not care whether we believe it. The debris field still exists. The cycles continue. The mechanisms turn, indifferent to our amnesia. And somewhere in the cosmic dark, fragments of ancient cataclysm wait for Earth to intersect their path once more. Modern science has confirmed what ancient myth refused to hide. Earth moves through zones of increased celestial danger. These regions are not hypothetical, they are mapped. We know the dates when the planet will encounter them. We know which years produce heightened meteor activity. We know that some objects travelling within these streams are massive enough to destroy cities, continents, or civilizations. What we do not know is whether any of them are already inbound. The Sumerians believed they knew. Their counting tablets do not merely track cycles, they terminate at specific junctures. Some end abruptly, as if the writer expected that no further record would be necessary. Others contain chilling phrases like, "After this, the watchers will be needed no longer." The meaning is unmistakable. The cycle ends with return. If their calculations were correct, the sky itself will announce the moment. Unusual meteors, fiery streaks at dawn, bright fragments crossing the constellations associated with catastrophe. When those signs appear, the countdown accelerates. The modern world is filled with distractions, screens, cities, noise, but none of these can prevent an object from space from entering our atmosphere. The Sumerians understood this with clarity that borders on obsession. Civilization cannot negotiate with the heavens, it can only prepare. The Sumerians prepared not by inventing weapons or defenses, but by building a memory. They believed that knowledge was the only shield capable of spanning millennia, that forewarned descendants could avoid the mistakes of their ancestors. Their fatal assumption was that memory would endure. It did not. We are, in their reckoning, a civilization perched at the edge of forgetting, mere steps away from repeating the cycle they tried to prevent. Their words were not poetic, they were instructions. We ignored them. Now, a silence stretches across time, a silence that was once filled with desperate voices pressing warnings into clay. And if those voices spoke again, what would they say? They would not talk of gods. They would not speak in riddles. They would say, "Watch the sky. Count the years. Remember, because the heavens do, and they are patient." Whether we choose belief or disbelief, readiness or negligence, vigilance or arrogance, the cycle does not change. The great clock of destruction continues its rotation, and one day, perhaps in our lifetime, perhaps in the lifetime of those who follow us, the hand will strike the hour again, The Sumerians tried to ensure that someone would be awake when that hour came. The question we must ask is terrifyingly simple. Are we? The ancient world was not ignorant. It was wounded. It lived beneath a memory too vast for speech, too terrifying for ritual, too important to entrust to anything as fragile as mythology. The Sumerians understood something that later civilizations forgot. Knowledge that is not anchored to purpose decays. A warning that loses its context becomes faith, and faith, no matter how passionately believed, cannot protect a world that no longer remembers what it was meant to guard against. For centuries after the rise of Sumer, other cultures borrowed fragments of its cosmology. Priests, kings, and scholars copied bits of astronomical lore, but stripped away the urgency. Each retelling diluted the original message. Like a whisper passed through generations until its meaning was no longer recognizable. Those who inherited the stars forgot why they were counting them. Yet the remnants of that forgotten truth still cling to the edges of human history. The Akkadians recorded celestial omens. The Babylonians mapped constellations with obsessive detail. The Egyptians aligned temples to solstices and stellar risings. The Maya built pyramids calibrated to track Venus. The Hebrews wove warnings of stars falling and fire from heaven into their scriptures. The Greeks turned cosmic catastrophe into mythic battles between titans. Cultures separated by oceans, languages, and epochs shared a common signature. The sky was not safe. The pattern is undeniable. Every ancient civilization capable of writing recorded a time when the world nearly ended. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, physically. Their descriptions vary in imagery, but not in theme. Darkness blotted out the sun. Fire rained from above. Waters surged across the earth. The air itself turned deadly. And always, the survivors emerged changed, fearful of forgetting. Knowledge did not spread outward from a single point. It radiated outward from an impact zone. Once this realization took hold, researchers began re-examining the foundations of archaeology. Many early assumptions collapsed. Civilizations were no longer isolated phenomena. They were recovery efforts, reconstructions guided by memory fragments, preserved like embers in the ashes of the world before. Humanity had not invented mathematics, architecture, and astronomy because it was curious. It inherited them because it was terrified. The deeper scholars looked, the clearer the picture became. The Sumerians had not been alone in their vigilance. They were merely the last generation to remember the full extent of their duty. Their tablets hinted at previous cycles, at civilizations erased so thoroughly that only whispers remained. Their myths speak of beings who rose from the waters after the last destruction, teachers, sages, keepers of knowledge. Whether literal or symbolic, their purpose was unmistakable: to restart civilization before the night sky completed another revolution. This revelation forces a re-evaluation of humanity's progress. What we call technological advancement may be nothing more than the slow recovery of knowledge once possessed and then lost. Our innovations, writing, calendars, measurement systems, might be echoes of something older, something erased, something that ended abruptly, not because humanity failed, but because the cosmos intervened. If that is true, then the Sumerians were the first to stand again after the fall. They were not at the dawn of civilization. They were in the aftermath. They believed the sky was governed by cycles because they had witnessed one end. Their lives were oriented around ensuring that the next cycle would not catch humanity unprepared. But time is a patient adversary. It waits for memory to fade. Generations pass, warnings soften, a priest becomes a storyteller, a calculation becomes a parable, a constellation becomes a god, a disaster becomes a myth, and the meaning dies behind the metaphor. By the time later cultures inherited the ruins of Sumer, the original purpose of its astronomical infrastructure had already begun to blur. The Babylonians preserved the numbers but lost the terror. The Greeks preserved the stars but lost the cycles. The Romans preserved the calendars but lost the watch. The myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the heavens, may not have been an invention but a memory, of a fire that came without lightning, whose source was not earthly anger, but celestial mechanics. The biblical flood may not have been a metaphor for sin, but a record of a world plunged into darkness after an impact lofted debris into the atmosphere, postponing sunrise for years. The Vedic texts that speak of weapons brighter than 1,000 suns may not be fantasy, but eyewitness testimony rendered incomprehensible by time. We laugh at the past because we misunderstand it. We dismissed its warnings because we mistook its caution for superstition. But superstition does not leave behind melted deserts, vitrified sand, and soot-filled layers of sediment stretching across continents. Superstition does not align temples with celestial risk windows. Superstition does not encode orbital periods into myth. Only memory does that, and memory has limits. The Sumerians believed they could outrun oblivion by writing warnings into clay. But clay cracks, empires crumble, languages die. What remains is not the message, but its ghost, and that ghost whispers a single idea. The sky remembers even if we do not. The Sumerians did not imagine the heavens as benevolent. They saw them as a place of recurrence, an eternal wheel whose turning could not be stopped. They did not believe humanity was doomed. They believed humanity was forgetful, and forgetting was the true catastrophe. Modern humans stand on a precipice the Sumerians foresaw. We have regained the ability to detect objects approaching Earth. We can track asteroids large enough to destroy continents. We know the physics of impacts, the fragility of our atmosphere, the combustible nature of civilization. Yet we approach this knowledge with arrogance, as if our technological superiority grants immunity. It does not. Our satellites are blind to objects approaching from the sunward side. Our detection systems are incomplete. Our societies are unprepared. Our infrastructures are fragile. We have built towers of glass and steel, not granaries and observatories. We have stockpiled wealth, not wisdom. We are once again a species that looks at the stars without fear. And that may be the most dangerous delusion of all. The Sumerians did not fear the heavens because they were primitive. They feared them because they were informed. Their terror was not ignorance, it was memory. They knew that fire falling from the sky was not mythic imagery. It was history. The air could ignite, the horizons could burn, the wind could kill, cities could vanish in an instant, and the universe would not notice. It is tempting to dismiss their calculations as coincidence, but coincidence does not guide architecture across millennia. Coincidence does not define calendars. Coincidence does not outlive civilizations. Only purpose does that. The more we excavate, the more it becomes clear that the past was not trying to entertain us. It was trying to speak to us. And it was not whispering metaphors. It was shouting warnings. Warnings we ignored. Warnings we forgot. Warnings we may soon need. For the Sumerians believed the cycle was not finished. They believed the sky would once again open. They believed that the fire would return. And they believed that when it did, only those who remembered would survive. We no longer remember. The cycle does not care. It continues. Sooner or later, the wheel turns back to the point where it began. And when it does, the sky will reveal what the Sumerians tried so desperately to explain. That the universe has rules we do not set, schedules we cannot alter, and consequences we cannot negotiate. We are not exempt from what came before. We are simply next. There comes a moment in every long-forgotten story when the silence breaks. Not because the truth has changed, but because the listener finally becomes capable of hearing it. Humanity stands now where the Sumerians once stood, on the fragile edge between complacency and awareness. Yet unlike them, we no longer possess the memory that made vigilance instinctive. We have replaced awe with distraction, hunger with convenience, and understanding with arrogance. We believe our machines have made us immune to the sky. We confuse prediction with control, but the heavens remain indifferent, ancient and relentless, operating on scales of time we refuse to comprehend. For thousands of years, the Earth has drifted along its orbit as if nothing waits beyond its path. But every so often, faint reminders emerge, glowing streaks across the night sky, showers of meteors denser than usual, spaceborne fragments punching through the atmosphere with thunderous roars. Newspapers call them curiosities, scientists catalogue them, social media turns them into spectacle, and then we forget again, because forgetting is easier than understanding what it means to be vulnerable. Yet beneath our feet lie continents carved by impacts so vast they altered climate, oceans, and biology. Craters thousands of meters wide remind us that cosmic objects are not hypothetical. They are historical. The Earth is not a sanctuary. It is a target that moves through fields of potential catastrophe. We inhabit a world that has been shattered before and will be shattered again, not because of fate or divine judgment, but because it is the nature of celestial bodies to collide, fragment, and repeat. The Sumerians were forced to accept this truth because they lived in the shadow of its consequences. Their world was not merely old, it was inherited. They did not build on empty land. They built on ruins. They cultivated soil, enriched by fire from the heavens. They gazed at a sky still scarred from the last cycle, and understood that the next one would come. Their cities were born from the memory of an impact. Their writing was born from the desperation to preserve what had nearly been lost. Their myths were structured to outlast civilization itself. And yet, myth decays. Clay crumbles, languages die. The story becomes detached from the warning it once carried, leaving behind symbols without meaning, rituals without purpose. We marvel at ancient ziggurats, yet fail to comprehend why they point where they do. We translate tablets and treat them as curiosities instead of instructions. We categorize celestial events as folklore instead of history. In this way, we have become the very thing the Sumerians feared, a civilization in possession of knowledge without comprehension, wealth without wisdom, power without memory. They knew what it meant to rebuild after the sky had burned. We do not. Our instruments can detect asteroids, yet we track only a fraction of those that cross Earth's orbit. Our telescopes can peer across galaxies, but they struggle to see objects approaching from the blind side of the sun. Our communication networks can transmit thousands of trivialities every second, yet they cannot guarantee that even a single civilization will heed a warning that spans millennia. We are advanced, yes, but we are not prepared. The ancients did not leave us commandments, they left us patterns. They showed us that the universe does not act randomly, that destruction has intervals, that survival belongs not to the strongest but to the most aware. Their legacy is not prophecy, it is mathematics. But mathematics is useless if forgotten. Somewhere in their final centuries, the Sumerians sensed their knowledge slipping away. Their later inscriptions take on a tone of urgency, as if begging the future not to abandon the watch. They speak of a time when humans would no longer see danger in the stars. They warn that the loss of memory is the first omen, that forgetfulness signals the beginning of vulnerability. And here we are. We build machines to carry us into space, but fewer people than ever can recognize a constellation. We illuminate our cities so brightly that the stars vanish from sight. We treat the sky as scenery instead of system. We trust that warning systems we barely understand will protect us, unaware that our ancestors once believed the same before the heavens opened. The irony is devastating. We now possess the technology the Sumerians could only dream of: telescopes, satellites, sensors, supercomputers. Yet we lack the cultural consciousness that made their vigilance sacred. They feared forgetting because they knew memory was the only defense that could span cycles longer than empires. They feared comfort because comfort breeds blindness. They feared the day when humankind would stop watching the sky. That day has come. Some dismiss ancient warnings as primitive superstition. But superstition does not chart orbital periods across thousands of years. Superstition does not align architecture with astronomical phenomena. Superstition does not survive the rise and fall of empires, outlasting thrones and languages. Only truth does that. The truth is simple. The universe is not still. It breathes in cycles. Debris fields shift. Orbits intersect. Fire returns. And humanity, whether or not it believes, exists within this pattern. The question is not whether the cycle will complete. It is whether anyone will be awake when it happens. Perhaps the Sumerians could not save their ancestors, but they tried to save us. They wrote not for themselves, but for the unborn. They carved warnings into clay because they feared the erosion of speech. They aligned temples because they feared the drift of stars. They embedded knowledge into myth because they feared the collapse of language. Their fear was not weakness, it was wisdom. Now we must decide what we will do with that inheritance. We can ignore it, as countless civilizations have, burying their ruins beneath optimism and denial. Or we can learn, truly learn, that history is not a line, it is a circle, and those who stand at its edge without understanding are not survivors, they are the next casualties. The skies are quiet now, but quiet skies are deceptive. The Sumerians would tell us that silence is not peace, it is warning. The absence of fire is not safety, it is opportunity. The world is not safe because nothing has happened recently. The world is safe because the universe is waiting. And what do we do as we wait? We entertain ourselves, we forget. We build towers of glass instead of monuments of memory. We design economies rather than calendars. We trust governments more than patterns. We believe our tools make us invincible, yet our tools cannot deflect an object the size of a mountain. Our tools cannot erase orbital trajectories millions of years old. Our tools cannot negotiate with a comet. The Sumerians would not be surprised by our arrogance. They saw it before. They recorded what happens next. Their cities fell, their temples crumbled, their language died, but their warning survived, suspended in symbols we only now begin to read again. To them the stars were not stories, they were schedules. They were not mysteries, they were measurements. They were not divine eyes watching humanity. They were destinations in a cycle of return. They expected us to be ready. We are not. The clock that terrified them still turns, the heavens still move, the debris fields still wait. Whether we choose to listen or not, the universe remembers. And when the cycle closes, it will not ask who believed, who doubted, who laughed, or who warned. It will simply arrive. The sky that once destroyed the world has not finished its work. The universe does not stop to argue with those who forget. It does not care about our skepticism, our pride, or our disbelief. It does not ask permission, it returns. And when it does, perhaps the greatest tragedy of all will be that the first civilization tried to save the last, but the last was too distracted to understand. The Sumerians lit a signal fire across time. We were meant to see it and prepare. Instead, we built cities tall enough to block the view. The Sumerians were not alone in their dread of the heavens. Though they formed the first coherent system of memory, they were merely one link in a chain that stretched deeper into humanity's subconscious. Long before clay tablets preserved script, long before cities rose from the floodplains, long before ritual became architecture, fragments of a much older understanding haunted the minds of wandering tribes. They carried no writing, no mathematics, no temples, yet they carried something more ancient still. Stories of a night when the world ended. These stories were not bound to a single geography. They appeared wherever human beings settled long enough to remember fear. Across the frozen plains of early Europe, hunters whispered of a burning sphere that shattered the sky. Along the coasts of Asia, fishermen spoke of waves that swallowed mountains after a star fell into the sea. In Africa, elders recalled how the sun vanished behind smoke that blotted out the heavens for so long that the animals fled and the rivers shriveled. None of these peoples met one another. None traded symbols or travellers, yet their stories were siblings. What connects civilizations is not blood or culture. It is catastrophe. The Sumerians, however, were the first to take catastrophe and distill it into calculation. They refused to memory drown in metaphor. But even they could not preserve everything. The world before them was too large, too broken, too scattered. What they inherited was not a chronicle, it was a wound. Imagine a civilization predating even Sumer, one older than our archaeology allows, whose ruins lie beneath sediments so deep they might as well be beneath time itself. Imagine a world advanced enough to leave traces, but not durable enough to survive fire from the sky. Such a world would not disappear peacefully. It would collapse under the suddenness of destruction and be swallowed by silence. But its survivors, few, desperate, half blinded by ash, would carry fragments of knowledge without context. They would not understand what had happened. They would only know that the sky betrayed them. Those fragments eventually became Sumer, not invention, but recovery, not emergence, but return. If that hypothesis holds, then we must confront a disturbing truth. Humanity may not be climbing a ladder of progress. It may be running on a treadmill, gaining speed yet going nowhere, forever haunted by a cosmic predator it refuses to remember. The difference between survival and extinction lies not in technology, but in continuity. The Sumerians understood continuity. We do not. Their warnings did not end with tablets. They built vast burial chambers for royalty and scholars, stocked not with wealth, but with symbols, constellations, numbers, patterns. These tombs were not monuments to the dead. They were libraries disguised as coffins. Knowledge was buried so that invaders could not burn it. The dead protected wisdom for the living. Modern archaeologists dismiss the star charts carved onto burial artifacts as religious motifs, unaware that their positions mirror alignments associated with periods of cosmic instability. The ancients were not decorating graves. They were embedding coordinates. To truly grasp the scale of their obsession, one must consider the lengths they went to secure the watch. In some city-states, entire cults existed for the sole purpose of calculating time. These were not mystics. They were accountants of eternity. They measured shadows, tracked rising stars, recorded anomalies in weather patterns, and cross-referenced them against celestial events. They understood that catastrophe did not emerge from chaos. It emerged from precision. Yet their greatest fear was not the sky itself. It was losing the ability to see. Civilization blinds itself slowly. It begins with prosperity. Prosperity breeds luxury. Luxury breeds distraction. Distraction breeds neglect. Neglect breeds amnesia. And amnesia is how worlds end. The Sumerians saw this cycle unfolding in their own lifetime. Their earliest rulers were astronomer kings who governed not through divine mandate, but through calculation. They kept time because time kept them. But as centuries passed, power shifted. Kings became warriors, priests became politicians, astronomy became ceremony, ceremony became symbol, and symbol lost its meaning. The watch faltered. There are tablets documenting the moment the Sumerians realized their descendants would fail. They speak of a reckoning, not divine judgment, but cosmic recurrence. They lament that one day people would cease to understand the very warnings left for them. They feared that when danger returned, their language would be gone, their city buried, their sky ignored. They were right. The people who inherited their ruins marveled at their architecture, admired their myths, and stole their gods, but not their purpose. What had once been an elaborate survival manual became entertainment. What had once been a warning became worship. What had once been a civilization of watchers became a civilization of dreamers. It is uncertain whether the Sumerians died believing they had succeeded or fearing they had failed. What is certain is this: they expected future civilizations to rebuild the watch. They believed that one day the sky would grant humanity enough power to rediscover the truth. They saw history not as a straight line, but as an hourglass endlessly turning. Each cycle begins the same way, with silence. Silence before recollection. Silence before comprehension. Silence before the heavens move again. Now, after millennia of forgetting, the silence is almost over. Humanity has once more lifted its eyes toward the sky, but not with reverence. It watches for resources, for planets to colonize, for comets to harvest, for worlds to conquer. Our telescopes are pointed outward not to protect us, but to expand us. We no longer fear the heavens, we intend to claim them. We have begun to behave not like survivors, but like inheritors. We assume the universe belongs to us, but the Sumerians would tell us that no one inherits a world still in danger. They would tell us that the sky is not territory, it is history, and history is patient. There is a kind of arrogance born not of power, but of ignorance fueled by distance. We believe that whatever threat stalked the Sumerians cannot stalk us. We believe we have outgrown the cosmos, but knowledge without context is a weapon without aim, and a weapon without aim eventually becomes a wound. We have begun preparing spacecraft capable of deflecting celestial objects, yet we do not understand how many objects exist. We map asteroids but ignore comets. We track large bodies but dismiss smaller ones, the very kind that can detonate with the force of nuclear fire before they ever touch the ground. We interpret the universe through instruments, not through memory. The Sumerians would not be impressed. They knew that vigilance is not a machine, it is a mindset. Our mistake is believing that survival is a problem solvable by invention. It is not. It is a discipline solvable only by remembrance. A world that remembers prepares. A world that forgets rebuilds. A world that denies dies. The most terrifying lesson in Sumerian legacy is not that the sky destroys worlds. It is that humanity enables it by forgetting. We are not the first to possess knowledge. We are merely the first to misunderstand possession as immunity. If the cosmic cycle continues, and every scrap of ancient memory points to its inevitability, then we stand at the midpoint between awakening and reckoning. The Sumerians were the first voice in this cycle. We may be the last. But cycles do not end because their participants desire closure. They end because something arrives. Something always arrives. And when it does, there will be no negotiation, no pleading, no denial. There will be only reality, raw and unforgiving, indifferent to memory and morality alike. In that moment, every device, every machine, every monument to our brilliance will mean nothing unless we finally understand what the Sumerians understood. The sky does not forget. It waits. And so must we, unless we choose to become what they feared most. The civilization that saw the warning, heard the echo, decoded the symbols, but looked away because the truth was too large for comfort. If that happens, if humanity once again allows silence to become blindness, then Block 7 will not be the end of the story. It will be the beginning of our epilogue. If you could stand beside one of those ancient Sumerian scribes for a single night, watching as he tilted his head back to study the band of stars arcing over the Mesopotamian plain, you would notice something unsettling in his posture. He's not relaxed. He's not contemplating beauty. His gaze is not that of a poet or a dreamer. It is the gaze of someone counting the teeth of a predator. Every flicker, every streak of light, every wandering star is a possible warning, each one a reminder that the disaster which birthed his world might not be finished with it. We no longer look at the sky that way. When a meteor cuts across the night now, people take out their phones. They wish for luck. They post pictures. They do not imagine cities flattened, rivers turned to steam, or soils infused with the microscopic scars of shock and heat. They do not see the streak and think, that could have been larger. For the Sumerian, that thought was never far away. His children, and their children, would inherit the habit of watching. They would inherit the numbers, the alignments, the cycles. But with each generation, comfort would tug at the edges of memory. Fields would yield good harvests. Trade would fill storehouses. New gods would be welcomed, new stories told, and in those stories the sky would become less a threat and more a stage. The stars would become personalities, the comets omens of kings' fortunes rather than precursors of fire. Slowly the predator turned into a symbol. The teeth were still there, but fewer and fewer people remembered what it felt like to be bitten. Our age has perfected this amnesia. We have taken even the broken fragments of ancient fear and filed them under fiction, apocalypses, doomsday tales, apocalyptic cinema. We consume destruction as entertainment, safe in the belief that it belongs to the screen. But the sky does not recognize genres. It does not distinguish between imagination and record. It only follows trajectories. Consider for a moment how fragile our awareness truly is. If a large object were discovered tomorrow on a collision course with our world, the first hours would not be filled with calm, methodical readiness. They would be filled with confusion, arguments, denial. Politicians would debate. Commentators would speculate. Social media would erupt with conspiracies and jokes. People would ask whether the trajectory was real, whether the scientists were lying, whether someone was exaggerating. We would not respond as a species trained for generations to expect this. We would respond as a crowd surprised at a fire alarm, wondering if it's just another drill. The Sumerians did not have that luxury. The fire had already happened. When we look back at them now, through museum glass and academic language, we often speak of them in the past tense as if their relevance is purely historical. They're categorized as ancient Mesopotamia, a chapter in a textbook, a unit in a course, a segment in a documentary. But if they were alive today, standing beneath the glow of our city lights and the hum of our power lines, I suspect they would look at us not with awe at our technology, but with horror at our blindness. They would ask, "Where are your watchers?" We would point to observatories, radar arrays, space agencies. We would speak of telescopes and satellite surveys, of catalogues of near-Earth objects, of international projects devoted to planetary defense. On paper, we could prove that we have thought about the problem. We would show them lists of measured diameters and calculated orbits and probabilities. We would show them simulations, and then they would ask the question that matters: does everyone know? Because they lived in a world where knowledge that stayed in temples and palaces was useless. If the farmers did not know why the sky mattered, they would not listen when priests said, "Harvest early." If the travellers did not know what a red star in the east meant, they would ignore warnings to abandon certain roads. If families did not know why suddenly the lamps must be extinguished and the windows sealed, they would leave their doors open and choke on dust. In their world, knowledge had to be culture, not specialty. In ours, it is the opposite. Knowledge lives in narrow towers. Specialists share information with other specialists. Reports are written, archived, cited, and forgotten except by those whose job is to handle such reports. Most people go about their lives unaware that the sky is anything more than a backdrop. They do not know that twice a year, the Earth moves through regions of space where the number of impactors increases. They do not know that small explosions happen in the atmosphere all the time, mostly over oceans and remote regions. They do not know how thin the line really is between spectacle and erasure. We think we are safe because the sky is mostly quiet above our heads. The Sumerians knew the sky is quietest before it speaks. Their tablets sometimes describe long periods of calm, years when the omens were minor, when the meteors were few, when the weather followed ordinary patterns. In those years, the temptation to relax must have been powerful. Why continue the exhausting work of nightly observations when nothing happens? Why maintain costly temples and train new priests when the world seems stable? Why keep repeating stories of destruction that no living person has seen? Stories that sound almost unbelievable in their scale. They continued anyway. The reason was not faith, it was continuity. Someone had impressed upon them, perhaps in the earliest days after the last catastrophe, that the universe does not owe explanations. It does not warn in ways that feel dramatic or cinematic. It merely repeats what it has done before, on a schedule too large for impatient minds. It is hard for us to think in such timescales. We plan in months, in years. Governments plan in election cycles. Corporations plan in quarters. A few institutions like universities or religious orders might plan in decades. Very few among us plan in centuries. Almost no one plans in millennia. The sky plans in tens of thousands of years. Those who survive are not the ones who are strongest in the moment. They are the ones whose ancestors left behind instructions. The Sumerians were trying desperately to be those ancestors. We now have the ability to read their instructions. That is what makes our position uniquely precarious. For most of history, humans did not have access to the Sumerian voice. Their tablets were buried, their language dead, their cities forgotten. A farmer in medieval Europe, a sailor in the Indian Ocean, a priest in pre-Columbian America, none of them could possibly have known what the Sumerians saw in the sky. We can. We have unearthed their words. We have translated their symbols. We have reconstructed their astronomical alignments. We have tested their observations against modern simulations. And the more we do, the clearer their message becomes. We cannot claim ignorance anymore. When future archaeologists, if there are any, dig through our layers of sediment and rubble, they may find our satellites shattered, our metal corroded, our servers erased. But they may also find records that show we knew, that we had calculated the probabilities, that we had mapped the risk, that we had read the warnings carved in clay by hands 5,000 years dead. Then they will ask the question we ourselves avoid. If they knew, why did they not prepare? The uncomfortable answer is that knowing is not the same as believing, and believing is not the same as acting. The Sumerians knew through memory. Their belief was tied to the ground beneath their feet and the scars in their soil. Their action was culture. Align the temples, train the watchers, maintain the count. Their entire way of life was built around bridging the gap between knowledge and action. We know through abstractions, charts, papers, conferences. Our belief is often shallow, oscillating between alarm and apathy with each news cycle. Our action is limited, constrained by budgets and politics and the endless competition of priorities. We can imagine threats on planetary scales, but we struggle to make room for them in calendars already full of smaller crises. In that sense, perhaps we are more advanced technologically than the Sumerians, but less advanced existentially. We have more tools, they had more clarity. If you listen closely, beneath the hum of our modern world, you can almost hear the echo of their fear. It vibrates in our stories of the end. Novels of extinction, films about impacts, whispered anxieties about a sudden flash in the sky. We joke about it, we meme it. But the fact that we keep returning to it suggests that something in us remembers even now in some deep layer of inherited terror that we live not in a closed world but in an open system, a small planet in a crowded, indifferent cosmos. Perhaps that is why, late at night, when city lights flicker and the world feels briefly quieter, some people still step outside and look up. Perhaps that is why a shooting star can still stir something ancient in us. Not a wish, but a shiver. There is a part of the human mind older than history, older than writing, older even than language. It belongs to the nights when our ancestors huddled in darkness, listening for predators, watching for storms, and sometimes watching the sky burn. That part of us does not think in words. It thinks in patterns. It recognizes repetition. It understands, in a way reason often refuses to, that what has happened can happen again. The Sumerians gave that instinct a vocabulary. They turned a feeling into a system. They transformed dread into discipline. Now, we have a choice they never had. We can combine both. We can bring together the instinct that still flinches at unseen danger with the technology capable of mapping that danger in detail. We can choose to treat the sky as the Sumerians did, not as a passive backdrop, nor as an abstract field of research, but as an active environment in which we are embedded, a system that sometimes turns hostile. That choice would require more than telescopes. It would require humility. A civilization that believes itself invulnerable will not invest in precautions for a threat it refuses to respect. A civilization that understands itself as temporary, fragile, and small might. This is the true gift hidden in the Sumerian legacy. Not fear, not doom, not resignation. Perspective, a sense of proportion. The knowledge that cities, empires, and even species are temporary guests in a universe whose cycles continue whether they notice or not. It is a hard gift to accept because it strips away comforting illusions of permanence. But it is also a liberating one because it gives our choices weight. If we are temporary, then what we do now matters more, not less. We cannot assume someone else will fix what we ignore. We cannot assume another civilization will rise if we fall. There is no guarantee that the cycle will always include recovery. The Sumerians felt responsible for people who did not yet exist. They wrote for us. We can decide whether that effort was wasted. All it takes, in the end, is the willingness to look up. Not for beauty, not for escape, but for understanding. To see the sky not as a ceiling, but as a story. To recognize that for thousands of years, that story has included fire. To remember that once, long ago, a people stood beneath the same stars and vowed that if the sky ever burned again, their descendants would not be caught unprepared. Those descendants are us. The stars overhead have not changed. The question is whether we have. It is one thing to know that a threat exists. It is another to understand what it means to live beneath it. The Sumerians lived with that weight every day, not because they lacked distractions or comforts, but because memory had not yet been diluted. They still felt the echo of catastrophe in the way their cities were built, in the geometry of their temples, in the urgency of their calendars. Their world was shaped by an imprint of fear that was not irrational. It was inherited. It was the residue of survival. In our age, fear is something we attempt to cure. We treat it as illness, as weakness, as something that must be overcome through optimism or medication or distraction. But fear, in its purest form, is a navigational instrument. It points to truths too large for comfort. It warns us that safety is not guaranteed. And at its most refined, fear becomes vigilance. We have replaced vigilance with confidence. Confidence in technology. Confidence in progress. Confidence in the belief that humanity has outgrown the dangers faced by its ancestors. But progress is not immunity. It is merely adaptation. And adaptation only works when the environment remains stable, or when we understand how and why it changes. The environment we inhabit stretches beyond wind, rain, and temperature. Our true environment is cosmic. It includes objects that do not recognize borders, politics, or intentions. It includes events measured not in seasons, but in epochs. The Sumerians understood this. They treated the sky as both map and clock, past and future compressed into a terrain of stars. They looked upward because their danger came from above. Our danger comes from above too, but we look down, into screens, into markets, into ourselves. This inversion is more than cultural, it is existential. A civilization that forgets where the last blow came from will never see the next one coming. There is a strange arrogance that arises in societies that have not experienced existential threat for multiple generations. Time softens the memory of catastrophe. Stories become metaphors. Metaphors become traditions. Traditions become curiosities. And then the knowledge decays into mere ornament. We're surrounded by the ruins of civilizations that shared this trajectory. Temples whose alignments once warned of danger now draw tourists who see only beauty, unaware that every angle, every shadow, every stone once had purpose. Calendars once used to track cycles of destruction are now holiday schedules. Sacred numbers have become lucky charms. A cosmic operating manual has been downgraded into folklore. We call this cultural enrichment. It is cultural amputation. When a limb loses feeling, the body does not celebrate. It recognizes numbness as the onset of decay. Yet we celebrate numbness as progress. We believe that forgetting the past frees us, when in truth it only blinds us. The Earth's geological record does not lie. It tells us that destruction is not hypothetical. It happened, repeatedly. The planet bears marks like scars where impacts ended ages, redirected evolution, and erased entire ecologies. The line between epochs is written in soot and molten glass, in shocked quartz and buried horizons. Life ended before, not once, but many times, and yet every time, the survivors either forgot or were destroyed before they could remember. The Sumerians attempted to break that pattern. They tried to ensure that one civilization someday would inherit not just the world, but the reason it still existed. They did not expect to be worshipped. They expected to be understood. They were wrong. We unearthed their tablets, their mathematics, their architecture, and we admired them, but we did not integrate them. We categorized them. We turned their vigilance into trivia. We marveled at their ingenuity without asking why their ingenuity existed. We saw the watchtower, but not the beast it was built to observe. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if a single Sumerian were transported into our world. He would see lights in the sky, aircraft, satellites, rockets, and mistake them for omens. He would see our wealth and assume we had conquered the heavens. And then, when he learned that we had stopped watching, that we had lost the cultural instinct to fear the sky, he would not praise our progress. He would mourn our naivety. Civilization is not defined by what it builds, but by what it prepares for. The Sumerians prepared for cycles. They assumed recurrence. Their greatest sin from the perspective of time was hoping that their descendants would take the same responsibility. But responsibility rarely survives prosperity. Prosperity weakens memory. Memory erodes vigilance. Vigilance collapses trust. When the next catastrophe arrives, it does so in a world convinced it cannot happen. That is the secret rhythm of extinction. It strikes at the peak of confidence. The dinosaurs were not struggling when the sky killed them. They were thriving. The Bronze Age civilizations were not dying when collapse came. They were flourishing. The Sumerians did not emerge because the world was weak. They emerged because the world before them had been strong, and strength had made it blind. What we call progress may simply be the period of calm between cycles. We track the stock market more carefully than the heavens. We measure inflation more carefully than meteor trajectories. We fear recessions more than extinctions. We worry about losing followers more than losing cultures. This inversion defines our era. The Sumerians would tell us a civilization is only as strong as its memory. Memory is not archives. It is not museums. It is not artifacts. Memory is behavior. If humanity does not change how it behaves in response to the cosmos, then everything we have built will follow the fate of Uruk, Akkad, and the cities whose names time has devoured. It will be dust over dust, erased not by malice but by physics. Some dismiss this possibility with a wave of statistical comfort. They say the odds of a civilization-ending impact in our lifetime are small. They forget that the last time such an object struck, there were no statistics. The universe did not consult probability tables. It acted, and the species that could not adapt vanished. We assume we are different. We assume intelligence protects us. But intelligence without humility is sabotage. Intelligence without memory is suicide. The Sumerians, for all their brilliance, could not stop the forgetting. They laid the foundation, but entropy proved stronger. Time erodes not only stone, but meaning. It turns warnings into heritage, and heritage into noise. Our danger is not cosmic. Our danger is cognitive. If humanity continues to sever itself from the ancient instinct to prepare, then we will stand defenseless before a threat that has no reason to spare us. The universe does not hate life. It simply does not prioritize it. To survive the cosmos, we must become something unprecedented, a species that remembers longer than its myths, that plans beyond its leaders, that watches without being afraid of what it sees. We must reclaim the posture of the Sumerian scribe, standing beneath the night sky, searching not for inspiration, but for motion. We are no longer powerless. We can track objects thousands of kilometers away. We can simulate trajectories decades in advance. We can launch missions that rendezvous with comets and asteroids and alter their paths. The difference between extinction and endurance may lie in whether we have the discipline to expand that ability before it becomes necessary. The Sumerians could not build rockets, but they built something harder, a culture of vigilance. We have the rockets. We do not have the culture. The universe will not wait for us to acquire it. There will come a night, perhaps quiet, perhaps distant, when a streak of light appears over the horizon brighter than any we have seen. Some will cheer, some will film, some will ignore it. A few, perhaps those who remember the buried warnings of ancient cities, will understand. And in that moment, our civilization will divide into two kinds of people, those who believe the sky is decorative and those who know it is alive. Only one of these groups has ever survived a cycle. Imagine for a moment that humanity suddenly remembered, not through panic, nor through revelation, but through a quiet collective realization. That history is not a staircase rising ever upward, but a wheel turning in long, slow arcs. Imagine that somewhere, buried beneath our skyscrapers and satellites, beneath our commerce and our noise, something ancient began to stir. A recognition that we were never alone on this path, that we were walking through the echo of footsteps older than civilization itself. At first, the shift would be subtle. A scientist presenting a paper on cometary debris streams might notice an unusual pattern in orbital data, one that aligns eerily with celestial markers catalogued thousands of years ago. A historian might find that flood myths across continents describe identical sequences of events in the same order, as though they were recollections of a single night. An astronomer might compare meteor trajectories from different centuries and discover that they converge not randomly but rhythmically. None of these observations alone would seem dangerous, but together they would form a shape in the darkness, like the outline of a predator revealing itself by the absence of sound. This is how truth returns, not with thunder, but with accumulation, and it has already begun. Across the world, quietly and without fanfare, researchers have started to notice anomalies that do not fit the narrative of linear progress. Ice cores reveal sudden climate shifts that coincide with mysterious layers of soot and microscopic particles forged under extreme heat. Ancient ruins show signs of abrupt abandonment without evidence of war or plague. Geological strata contain markers that appear simultaneously across continents, as if something had flicked a cosmic switch and reset the conditions of life on Earth. For generations, scientists interpreted these events independently. Volcanic eruptions, tectonic shifts, social collapses, each explanation neatly isolated, each phenomenon treated as local. But the universe is not local. It does not deliver catastrophe like parcels of misfortune sent to specific addresses. It sends patterns. Humanity has finally developed the tools to detect those patterns, but not yet the humility to accept what they imply. Governments do not like threats they cannot negotiate with. Economies do not like dangers that cannot be monetized. Religions do not like forces that refuse to assign moral value. And individuals do not like realizing that their lives are suspended in a cosmic environment entirely indifferent to their hopes. So we distract ourselves. We fill the void with noise. We narrate our existence as though we are protagonists in a grand ascent, destined for the stars, chosen by brilliance or biology or divine favor to become masters of creation. The Sumerians would laugh, not out of arrogance, but pity. They knew that civilizations do not ascend. They oscillate. Their worldview was not pessimistic. It was pragmatic. They believed that humanity could endure if it accepted its place within cycles larger than itself. They did not fight the wheel. They watched it. They marked its turning. They prepared their descendants for the point in the rotation where night darkens the sky and the fire returns. We have mistaken that vigilance for superstition. If humanity remembered, truly remembered, if it accepted that life is not a fortress, but a raft drifting through celestial currents, our societies would transform overnight. Priorities would reconfigure. The placement of cities, the allocation of resources, the direction of research, everything would shift around a single axis. The understanding that survival is not a reward for intelligence, but a consequence of awareness. Imagine a world where children learn constellations not as stories, but as coordinates. Where calendars include not only holidays, but risk windows marking when the planet moves through the densest portions of debris, streams. Where architecture incorporates shelters not for criminals or storms, but for the sky. Where nations compete not in displays of dominance, but in preparations for the inevitable. In such a world, humanity would be aligned not in ideology or belief, but in orientation, turning its collective gaze upward, just as the Sumerians once did. But that world does not exist. Ours does, and ours is divided, between those who think the past is finished, and those who understand the past is unfinished business. Modern culture treats ancient warnings as curiosities. It is fashionable to visit ruins, to marvel at stones whose builders we patronize as primitive. We take photographs in front of monuments aligned precisely with celestial markers, and wonder aloud how ancient people could have devoted so much effort to tracking the stars. We find the question charming. We neglect the answer. Because the stars killed the world that came before them. Why does a species that has never experienced cosmic violence build structures to measure it? Because it remembers what memory does not. In the shadows of this realization, humanity now stands at a crossroads. One path leads deeper into distraction, into a future where our tools grow smarter while our awareness grows duller, where machines track the heavens while humans ignore them, where data accumulates while meaning disintegrates. The other path leads back, not into regression, but into recalibration, into the rediscovery of something the Sumerians understood intimately, that civilization is not defined by monuments, but by questions. And the oldest question humanity has ever asked is not, who are we? Or where did we come from? It is, will the sky turn against us again? This question lingers like static beneath the human psyche. It manifests in creation myths, in prophecies, in nightmares of flames descending from the heavens. Even in our modern dreams, those restless visions that come when silence sinks beneath consciousness, there are flashes of falling stars, of skies cracking open, of horizons burning. These are not anxieties invented by contemporary minds. They are fossils of memory. The Sumerians did not create fear. They inherited it. Fear was their tutor. Observation was their response. Calculation was their weapon. We, in contrast, have inherited calculation but lost the reason for it. We have the numbers but not the narrative. We know how to measure but not why. Our satellites orbit blind, searching for signals without meaning. Our telescopes seek exoplanets when they should also guard our own. Knowledge without context is noise. Context without memory is superstition. The Sumerians fused all three into architecture. Now we hold only fragments. There may come a moment, decades from now, or centuries, when humanity's silence is broken by something luminous and fast. Something that enters the atmosphere at impossible speed, trailing fire brighter than the moon. At first, people will marvel. News anchors will call it a rare celestial event. Social networks will erupt with short videos capturing the moment. Some will declare it beautiful, a few will not. A few will feel an ancient certainty blooming in their chest, the kind of certainty that bypasses language and goes straight to bone. They will not know Sumerian. They will not recognize the numbers carved into clay 5,000 years ago. But somewhere deep inside, something that has been sleeping in humanity since the last cycle will awaken. They will remember without knowing why. Memory does not need permission. It only needs a trigger, and the sky is patient. The Sumerians believed, and perhaps correctly, that when the cycle begins again, humanity will not be warned by prophets, governments, or equations. It will be warned by instinct. That instinct will not feel like fear. It will feel like recognition. History is not waiting for us to act. It is waiting for us to understand. The clay tablets were not messages to the past. They were messages to the future. To us. We dig them up, catalogue them, store them under glass, and never ask why they survived when so much else did not. Warnings persist because someone wanted them to. They do not endure by accident. The universe itself seems to have selected them as artifacts of continuity. Perhaps the Sumerians were not only recording a cycle, perhaps they were part of it, and perhaps, if we allow ourselves to imagine it, the cycle did not erase them. It is finishing them through us. Because memory does not vanish, it migrates. And right now it is knocking on the walls of our civilization like a traveller returned from a journey we do not remember beginning. There is a peculiar moment in the history of every great realization, an instant in which knowledge stops being harmless and begins to change the shape of the future. Humanity is standing at that threshold now, though almost no one recognizes it. The clues are scattered across the sciences like pieces of a broken lens. Astronomers tracking unusual orbital paths, climatologists uncovering ancient layers of soot and debris inexplicable by volcanoes or industry, archaeologists finding temples aligned toward regions of the sky rather than gods, psychologists documenting a quiet rise of existential anxiety in people who have never known true danger. Each of these discoveries, taken alone, appears trivial. Together, they form the outline of something vast and unfinished, as though reality itself is preparing to reveal a truth too large to ignore. Modern civilization is drowning in information, yet starved of narrative. We gather data the way ancient people gathered grain, storing it in digital granaries that few ever open. The Sumerians understood something we have forgotten. Memory is not what is stored, it is what is carried. They created systems of continuity. We create archives. Archives can be deleted. Continuity survives fire. In our era, Knowledge is weightless. It floats across servers, bounces between screens, flickers through algorithms. It is more ephemeral than clay, more fragile than memory, more temporary than myth. We mistake access for understanding and documentation for preparedness. We think that because something is written down, the future will know what to do with it. But the universe is under no obligation to preserve instructions. It destroys them casually. The only knowledge that endures is the kind woven into behavior. The Sumerians surrounded themselves with vigilance. We surround ourselves with distraction. Modern astronomy has unintentionally resurrected the sky the Sumerians feared. Our telescopes see farther than any eye carved in stone, and yet that sight has not brought clarity. It has brought unease. Objects slip into our awareness from angles our instruments struggle to monitor. Some arrive from outside the solar system, like messengers that do not intend to stay. Others drift silently, waiting for nothing in particular, and yet intersecting Earth's orbit with disturbing precision. We catalogue risks the way ancient priests catalogued omens, but unlike them, we have convinced ourselves that knowing something exists is the same as controlling it. We do not treat danger as inevitable, we treat it as optional. Perhaps that is because modern humans live inside a shrinking temporal horizon. The Sumerians planned in centuries. We plan in election cycles. They built temples meant to endure generations. We construct glass towers designed to be profitable until maintenance becomes inconvenient. They believed memory was armor. We treat memory as nostalgia. In such a world, the idea of preparing for something that may not occur in a lifetime is absurd. We measure value by immediacy rather than longevity. The Sumerians would not recognize this as intelligence. They would recognize it as amnesia. Our civilization has reached a point where it knows more and understands less. We have decoded ancient calendars without asking why they were created. We have reconstructed star charts without questioning why the stars mattered. We have examined ruins as though they were inert artifacts rather than testimonies. In doing so, we have severed knowledge from meaning. The Sumerians feared losing the ability to interpret the sky. We have lost it, and yet congratulate ourselves for having the tools they lacked. We believe telescopes reduce danger, when they merely expose how little we understand. Still, something is shifting. Quietly, in the corners of scientific institutions, researchers who are not supposed to speak to one another begin to notice the same patterns. Ancient climate anomalies align with cosmic debris streams. Cultural collapses correspond to periods of increased meteor activity. Myths from distant cultures share identical sequences of fire, darkness, and hunger, as if recounting the same night from different vantage points. At first, such correspondences are dismissed. Coincidence is an easy refuge, but the mind, once it recognizes a pattern, cannot unsee it. What emerges from these patterns is not prophecy, it is recurrence. The universe is not hostile, it is cyclical. It does not destroy with malice, it destroys because it cannot help but continue moving. We, however, have made the mistake of assuming that movement has stopped. The Sumerians did not possess that luxury. Their world was built atop ashes still warm from the last catastrophe. They carried memory the way a child carries a burn, painful, involuntary, and instructive. We carry convenience, we carry distraction. We carry confidence in systems that were not designed to withstand cosmic interruption. If a civilization refuses to inherit memory, it inherits consequence. The Sumerians tried to ensure the former. We are drifting toward the latter. Their warnings were not theological but mechanical. They did not fear gods, they feared cycles. They understood that danger does not announce itself. It accumulates, it waits, it returns. It does not care whether we believe in it. Even now, humanity behaves as though the sky is a stage and not a battlefield. We treat meteors as spectacle, comets as curiosities, asteroids as trivia. We pretend the silence above our heads is proof of stability, not the pause between breaths. Yet somewhere in us, the ancient fear persists. It surfaces in films, in dreams, in cultural obsessions with endings. We imagine impact not because we crave destruction, but because memory is clawing its way through layers of denial. Our nightmares are not fantasies, they are fossils. One day, perhaps soon, a celestial object will appear in our sky brighter than any fireworks display. Some will marvel, some will photograph it. A few will feel something old awaken in them, a sense of recognition deeper than reason. They will not know the word for it. They will not understand the numbers, but they will feel the truth. This has happened before. The Sumerians tried to keep that truth alive. They wrote in clay so that no flame could erase their message. We store our warnings on servers that require electricity to exist. If darkness comes again, our memory will evaporate faster than smoke. The Sumerians feared the loss of vigilance. We have achieved it. Their legacy is not a mystery. It is an instruction. It does not ask for belief. It demands awareness. It tells us without metaphor and without mercy that the universe has not finished turning its wheel. The cycle continues, and unless we choose to become the first civilization that remembers long enough to act, the sky will write history again, not with words, but with impact. There are moments in human history that do not seem important when they happen, moments where the world continues as if nothing has changed, and yet beneath the surface something irreversible has begun. We are living through such a moment now, though most do not notice it. The signs are scattered across fields of study that rarely communicate with one another. Astronomers detect irregularities in the movement of celestial bodies. Climatologists uncover traces of ancient fires embedded deep in layers of polar ice. Archaeologists find structures aligned with stars rather than seasons. And psychologists record a growing unease in societies that cannot explain why they feel anxious despite unprecedented comfort. Each observation is too subtle to demand attention, yet together they form a pattern, and patterns once recognized become impossible to unsee. It is as if humanity is awakening not to new knowledge, but to something it once knew and lost. The Sumerians tried to prevent that loss. Their civilization committed itself to memory so intensely that their warnings survived 5,000 years of erosion, conquest, and neglect. They assumed, perhaps naively, that their descendants would decipher these warnings and act upon them. They underestimated how profoundly forgetting seduces those who believe themselves safe. The Sumerians lived close enough to catastrophe to fear it with reason. Something had happened before their cities emerged. Something sudden, something violent. Something that shattered a world advanced enough to leave scars, yet not sturdy enough to preserve a voice. The survivors of that event carried fragments of memory like ashes blown across generations, and when the Sumerians arose, they became the first to piece together those ashes into continuity. Their cities, their ziggurats, their rituals, their mathematics, none of these were beginnings. They were restorations. The sky above them was not a mystery to be adored. It was a ledger of danger. They studied the heavens not to admire stars, but to anticipate cycles. The cycle was everything. The cycle was the shape of existence. Civilizations, like stars, were temporary, cycles were eternal. The Sumerians built their identity around this truth. We built ours around avoiding it. Modern civilization confuses movement with progress. We sprint forward, inventing, consuming, expanding, congratulating ourselves on mastery of environments we barely understand. Our telescopes reveal galaxies beyond imagination, yet we ignore the rocks in our own path. Our satellites track comets and asteroids, yet our societies treat them as curiosities rather than consequences. We store knowledge in digital vaults that evaporate without electricity, believing permanence is defined by convenience. The Sumerians wrote warnings in clay because clay does not forget. We write warnings in servers because we assume forgetting no longer matters, but forgetting always matters. Forgetting is the doorway through which cycles re-enter the world. Every time a civilization collapses, it does so not because danger arrives suddenly, but because it arrives unnoticed. Collapse is not an event. It is a conclusion. It is the final line in a story nobody realized they were telling. The warnings were always there, scattered in signs, ignored by minds too occupied with the present to imagine the future. The Sumerians understood that time is not linear. It is recursive. The universe does not progress. It revolves. What has happened does not merely inform what will happen, it shapes it. There is no escape from cycles except understanding. There is no understanding without memory. There is no memory without vigilance. And vigilance is precisely what our age has abandoned. Humanity today behaves as though history is finished, as though the worst days are behind us and the future is merely a canvas for our ambitions. But the universe does not measure itself by human optimism. The cosmos is not impressed by technology. It respects only trajectory. Objects moving along ancient paths do not deviate because a species on a small blue sphere convinces itself it has evolved beyond consequence. The Earth has been struck before, it will be struck again. The question is not if, but when. The Sumerians knew this not through prophecy, but through pattern. They tracked celestial movements the way a shepherd tracks wolves. They understood that danger is not a surprise, it is an appointment. Our age has inherited the tools to see more clearly than any before it. We can observe distant planets, map gravitational anomalies, and detect cosmic objects years before they approach. And yet, despite possessing the means to understand, we lack the will. Knowledge without integration is noise. Information without memory is dust. We collect both as though accumulation grants immunity, never questioning whether the universe cares about our collections. It does not. It cares only about mass, velocity, and timing. It cares only about cycles. In laboratories and observatories around the world, there are people who feel a discomfort they cannot articulate. They see patterns that should not exist, correlations that defy coincidence, hints of recurrence in data separated by millennia. They know humanity is drifting closer to something ancient, though no one dares name it. To name something is to acknowledge its existence. To acknowledge existence is to take responsibility. Responsibility is the one thing modern civilization has forgotten how to carry. The human psyche senses what the intellect refuses to face. Our films romanticize apocalypse. Our literature obsesses over endings. Our nightmares are filled with falling fire. We interpret these obsessions as entertainment, unaware that we are reenacting a memory older than writing. Civilization has always been haunted by something it cannot remember directly. That is why endings fascinate us. We are not fascinated by destruction. We are familiar with it. Memory does not vanish. It hibernates. One day, perhaps not far from now, something will appear in the sky. Small at first, easily dismissed like all beginnings are. It will grow brighter. It will return night after night, moving against the stars with purpose. Some will call it beautiful. Some will think it harmless. A few will feel something ancient unlock inside them. They will not know the word for what they feel. They will simply understand. Recognition is not logic. Recognition is inheritance. When the sky changes, the bones remember. The Sumerians tried to give us a language for that recognition. They tried to ensure that when the cycle turned again, we would not stand ignorant beneath the heavens. They tried to craft a bridge across time, but bridges require travellers. Warnings require listeners. We have become so enamored with our reflection that we have forgotten to look up. Humanity has replaced cosmology with screens. We gaze at pixels instead of stars. The Sumerians feared one thing more than destruction: distraction. They knew the universe does not need hostility to end a world. It needs only ignorance. Ignorance is not the absence of knowledge. It is the refusal to apply it. Civilization does not collapse when people lack information. It collapses when people stop caring. The greatest threats are never unseen, they are unacknowledged. A meteor does not care whether a species believes in it. Fire does not care whether a city is proud. The universe is not a story written for human interpretation. We are characters, not authors. If humanity remembers, truly remembers, not as nostalgia but as understanding, then perhaps the cycle will continue without erasing us. If it forgets, then the cycle will complete itself the way it always has, cleanly, efficiently, indifferently. There is no malice in cosmic rhythm, only repetition. We are living in the quiet part of the pattern, the breath before speech, the stillness before consequence. Some sense it and grow restless, though they cannot articulate why. Others sense nothing and assume that silence equals safety. Silence never equals safety. Silence equals opportunity, for those who prepare and for those who ignore. The Sumerians prepared. We ignore. Which of us survives the cycle depends on which impulse triumphs. The sky will not announce its decision. It will simply arrive, as it has always arrived, when the cycle turns and memory fails. And when it does, the only question worth asking will be the one the Sumerians carved into clay, for those who would inherit the world after them. Will you remember in time, or will you remember too late? There is a strange illusion that grips every successful civilization, the belief that existence itself is stable. Stability feels natural when generations pass without upheaval, when sunrise follows sunrise, when the seasons arrive with predictable rhythm, and when cities grow so large that individuals mistake size for permanence. But permanence is not a feature of civilization. It is a side effect of memory temporarily intact. Once memory weakens, reality begins to shift, quietly at first, then all at once, like a cliff that crumbles not because of a single wave, but because of centuries of unnoticed erosion. Humanity stands at such a cliff now, though no one sees the cracks forming beneath their feet. Most people sense change only when it has already consumed them. They look back and say they never saw it coming. But civilization always whispers before it screams. The whisper is everywhere today, woven into the fabric of ordinary life, in our art, our conversations, our anxieties, our inexplicable fascination with endings. It is as though some buried part of the collective mind has begun noticing something moving in the dark, something familiar, something forgotten. Scientists do not speak openly of intuition. They trust measurements, not feelings. Yet numbers sometimes arrive before comprehension, like letters from a sender whose identity remains unknown. Data accumulates, anomalies repeat. Predictive models drift ever so slightly toward outcomes no one expected to take seriously. A researcher examining orbital paths notices a clustering of trajectories intersecting Earth's orbit at intervals that match an ancient calendar. She dismisses it as coincidence. Another scientist studying ancient extinction layers sees a periodic increase in atmospheric dust every few thousand years, dust containing compounds that form only at temperatures far beyond terrestrial fires. He chalks it up to volcanic activity. But deep inside, something unsettles them. They feel as though they are not discovering something new, but rediscovering something old. Humanity loves novelty because novelty flatters the ego. Rediscovery humbles it. The universe, however, cares little for ego. It behaves according to forces older than language. Cycles turn whether we acknowledge them or not. The Sumerians built their world around that truth. We build ours in defiance of it. Consider how we respond to celestial events now. When a meteor streaks across the night sky, children make wishes, influencers record videos, media outlets run headlines about a spectacular light show. No one asks why the sky is throwing stones. No one wonders how many stones remain. No one questions what these fiery intruders imply about the environment through which Earth is currently moving. Curiosity has been replaced by entertainment. Awareness has been replaced by distraction. The Sumerians would not marvel. They would count. In their worldview, surprise was failure. Surprise meant someone had stopped watching. Surprise meant memory had faltered. Surprise meant death. Our civilization is addicted to surprise. We seek it in stories, in images, in every flicker of novelty that crosses our screens. But the universe does not distinguish between stories and consequences. It contains no genre. It creates no audience. It leaves no survivors out of pity. And yet, despite our blindness, the world moves toward a threshold. Something is changing. It is subtle, like the faint pressure shift that precedes a storm. Economic systems tremble without obvious cause. Social cohesion frays. People everywhere report feeling as though time is accelerating, as though events are compressing, as though the future is pressing against the present. They do not know why. They do not need to. Instinct does not require explanation. It requires acknowledgement. The Sumerians understood instinct intimately. They honored it not as emotion but as information. Instinct is what remains when memory has become too faint to articulate. It is embarrassment dressed as intuition. It is fear disguised as curiosity. It is knowledge without language. Our ancestors once lived so close to annihilation that instinct became architecture. They built calendars because instinct warned them time was repeating. They aligned temples because instinct told them patterns mattered. They taught children stories because instinct recognized that stories outlast numbers. They treated the sky not as scenery, but as inheritance. We treat inheritance as burden. We believe progress means leaving the past behind. But memory is not opposition to progress. Memory is the scaffolding upon which progress is built. Without it, advancement becomes drift, movement without destination, acceleration without steering, momentum without meaning. A species that abandons memory becomes a passenger, not a navigator. We have become passengers. Humanity now moves through time as though carried by a current it does not see. Technology gives us the illusion of control, but illusions are brittle. They shatter the moment reality demands payment, and reality always demands payment. Every generation assumes it is exempt. Every civilization believes its knowledge will save it. Yet knowledge is not salvation. Knowledge is responsibility. Without responsibility, knowledge becomes ornament, and ornament cannot endure fire. There are those who sense this. They exist on the edges of institutions dismissed as alarmists, yet they do not shout. Their voices are quiet, steady, analytical. They have begun to connect dots that no one else sees as dots. Historical collapses align with celestial events. Cultural myths align with astronomical cycles. The end of one world has always been the beginning of another, not because fate demands it, but because memory fails. Imagine a civilization that truly understood this. Imagine a species that recognized history not as a line, but as a spiral. Such a species would not fear endings. It would respect them. It would prepare for them. It would refuse to be surprised by the universe. It would refuse to die simply because it forgot. The Sumerians tried to create such a species. They failed. Not because they lacked wisdom, but because they lacked continuity. They could not prevent the drift of meaning. They could not stop the slow erosion of purpose. Symbols turned sacred. Numbers turned mystical. Instructions turned poetic. Eventually the watch became ritual, the ritual became tradition, and the tradition became hollow. And when a tradition loses meaning, it becomes a prison disguised as culture. We are living inside many such prisons. They are invisible because they are comfortable. We celebrate them as heritage. We defend them as identity. We have mistaken the container for the message. The Sumerians did not care about form. They cared about survival. Everything else was decoration. Civilization is drowning in decoration. We adorn ourselves with complexity, believing intricacy equals intelligence. Yet complexity without coherence is just noise. A cathedral of data, if it lacks memory, is nothing but sand. The universe does not fear sand. There will come a moment, perhaps it has already begun, when humanity must choose whether to remain sand or become stone. Stone remembers. Sand scatters. The Sumerians left stone. We produce sand. The cycle approaches not like a storm, but like a shadow. Shadows lengthen imperceptibly until suddenly the entire landscape is dark. When the shadow falls, those who have forgotten will call it unprecedented. Those who remember will call it inevitable. The sky is not a metaphor. It is a ledger. It has recorded every extinction, every collapse, every silence that swallowed what once believed itself immortal. The ledger does not close at the end of an era. It closes when a species mistakes forgetting for peace. We are closer to that mistake than we realize, and yet paradoxically, we are also closer to remembering than any generation since the Sumerians. We have the tools they lacked. We have the knowledge they preserved. We have the vantage point their astronomers could not have imagined. All that remains is the hardest part, the decision to care. Memory does not return by accident. It returns because someone invites it. History does not repeat because fate demands it. It repeats because we do not listen. The Sumerians are not calling from the past. They are calling from the cycle, and the cycle is not finished. There comes a moment in the lifespan of every species when it must choose what it intends to become. Not choose in the sense of preference or desire, but choose in the sense of definition. The moment when survival stops being a reaction and becomes an identity. Humanity has reached that moment, though most do not yet see it, because great turning points do not arrive like storms. They arrive like dawn, unnoticed until the world has already changed. For millennia, we have lived inside the inheritance of others, inside paths laid by ancestors whose hands shaped stones, words and meanings we barely understand. The Sumerians were among the first to sense the fundamental truth of existence. The danger does not simply pass through history, it shapes it. They understood that survival depends not on power or wealth, but on vigilance and memory. They watched the sky not because they wished to conquer it, but because they remembered what had happened when the sky last turned hostile. They carried that memory through symbols, through stories, through carefully measured angles, through time itself, because they believed that forgetting was the first step toward extinction. And yet, forgetting came anyway, slowly, seductively, disguised as progress. Civilizations rose, marveled at their own brilliance, dismissed the warnings of the past as superstition, and repeated the same mistake. They confused stability with safety. Stability is temporary, safety is earned. The Sumerians knew this, we forgot it. But forgetting is never final. It is a pause, not an end. Memory has a peculiar way of returning when it is needed. It seeps back into consciousness not through scholarship but through intuition. It whispers in dreams, in fears we cannot explain, in our fascination with endings, in our restlessness before sleep, in the feeling that something vast is approaching, even if we do not know what it is. Humanity has begun to feel this again. Scientists see patterns they cannot dismiss. Historians find cycles they cannot ignore. Philosophers sense meanings that do not dissolve when questioned. The sky is no longer an abstract backdrop. It is becoming a reference point again, just as it was for the Sumerians. But unlike them, we do not merely observe, we have the means to respond. For the first time in the known history of life on Earth, a species possesses not only awareness of the cosmic environment, but the capability to influence its fate. This is not arrogance, it is recognition. We are no longer staring into the heavens as helpless witnesses. We are participants in a universe that does not care whether we understand it. The universe behaves according to rules older than atoms, rules that erase civilizations without malice and without pause. The comets, asteroids, and the remnants of creation do not target worlds. They move along paths carved long before words existed, long before creatures crawled from oceans, long before memory itself. What changes now is not the universe, it is humanity. Awareness has grown, ability has grown, responsibility has emerged. Responsibility is not a burden, it is a form of power. The Sumerians understood responsibility but lacked the tools to carry it beyond their age. Their message was not a prophecy of destruction, it was a question addressed to the future. Will someone remember? Will someone continue what we began? Will someone refuse to forget? They carved that question into clay because clay survives fire. They carved it into the stars because stars survive time. They hoped that someone someday would inherit not only their knowledge but their vigilance. They did not know who that someone would be. They could not imagine machines scanning the cosmos or spacecraft altering the paths of celestial bodies. But they believed in continuity, even when continuity seemed impossible. That belief was their legacy. And now, unexpectedly, improbably, their legacy has found its moment. Humanity has rediscovered what the Sumerians feared we would lose, the awareness that existence is conditional. Our presence on this world is not a guarantee. It is a debt paid not in worship but in preparation, a debt owed not to gods but to time. Time does not reward the forgetful, time replaces them, and yet, for the first time, the pattern of replacement may be interrupted. This does not mean the cycle ends. Cycles do not end. Cycles evolve. The Sumerians saw a cycle in which civilizations rose, forgot, and were erased. Now a new cycle is possible, One in which civilizations rise, remember, and endure. Endurance does not require perfection. It requires continuity. Continuity requires responsibility. Responsibility requires awareness. Awareness requires humility. Humility is not weakness, it is alignment. The Sumerians aligned themselves with the heavens because they recognized that the heavens were not decoration, they were information. We are beginning to understand this again. The telescopes that watch the skies today are not temples, yet they serve the same ancient function. They allow us to notice what approaches before it arrives. We can change trajectories. We can shield our world. We can do what no ancestor could. In doing so, we become what they hoped we would be. Custodians of memory, not prisoners of fate. The great fear of the ancient world was not annihilation, it was irrelevance. To be erased is less terrible than to be erased without teaching anything to those who come after. The Sumerians feared losing the thread of continuity. They feared the day when their symbols would be misunderstood, when their rituals would be stripped of meaning, when their warnings would be treated as myth. Their fear was justified. For a long time, that is precisely what happened. But meaning is patient. It sleeps, it waits, it returns when it is needed. Now it returns. Humanity has reached a threshold where knowledge and memory touch, where power meets purpose. This is not an ending. It is an inheritance. It is the first time in history that a civilization can finish what another began. We often imagine ourselves as the pinnacle of progress, but we are not its summit. We are its continuity. The Sumerians were not the first watchers. We are not the last. We are simply the first who can do more than watch. What then becomes of fear? It changes nature. Fear is no longer something that drives us backward. It becomes something that holds us upright. Fear becomes clarity. Clarity becomes choice. Choice becomes identity. Humanity does not need to fear the sky. It needs to understand it. When something is understood, it ceases to be a threat. It becomes part of the environment. Our ancestors lived beneath a sky that frightened them. We live beneath a sky that challenges us. The difference is profound. We are no longer children in a universe of giants. We are no longer passengers drifting through cycles of forgetting. We are stewards of what we have inherited. Stewards do not cower. Stewards prepare. Preparation is not reaction. It is philosophy. It is culture. It is destiny understood as responsibility instead of entitlement. This is the true end of the story. Not destruction, not prophecy, not doom, but transformation. For the first time in the long and fragile history of our species, humanity has earned the right to remain. Not because we are strong, but because we have begun to remember. Memory is not what lies behind us, it is what stands with us. The Sumerians began a sentence 5,000 years ago. Every civilization after them lost sight of it. We have found it again. We have read it. We have understood it. And now, for the first time, we can finish it. The end of forgetting is not the end of danger. It is the beginning of mastery. The end of silence is not the end of fear. It is the beginning of awareness. The end of this story is not an apocalypse. It is a beginning written in a language older than speech, older than stone, older than stars. The Sumerians preserved that language. We can speak it now. The sky still watches. The cycle still turns. But we are no longer waiting for what comes next. We are part of it. And that, finally, is enough. Not because we escaped destiny, but because we accepted it. Not because we survived by chance, but because we chose to remember. In memory there is continuity. In continuity there is civilization. In civilization there is meaning. And where meaning endures, nothing is truly lost.